Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Today I'm going to be joined by Meg Smith, who is the director of the Vermont Women's Fund. Meg, thank you so much for joining me today.
You are so welcome, Sarah. It's great to be here.
So to get started, what sparked your interest in women's studies? I know that you studied that at Hampshire College. What made you want to do that?
I came from pretty much a matriarchy. Growing up, I had three sisters, no brothers. Most of my sisters actually had girls themselves, but I had parents and grandparents who had very strong female figures. And it really wasn't until I got to college and I started realizing that this was a whole world of study, that women had been repressed and held back for generations, and I couldn't understand why that would be. So I decided to look at it sort of from an academic point of view, as well as, just a social interest of my own. Mm-hmm. So that kind of began it. And it's almost like it resurfaced many years later when this job came up, and I suddenly had the opportunity to run the Women's Fund. Mm-hmm. And what also had appealed to me about the Women's Fund was that it uses philanthropy or economic power to make change. And in our world, in our culture, in our capitalist society, power is usually equated with financial power. Mm-hmm. And I wanted women to be able to hold that and use it and implement it to make positive social change.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how did you come into this position at the Women's Fund?
Complete fluke. I had been working in media and communications for most of my career, public relations, and literally I had not been working for several years by choice. I was taking some time off, and I was recruited, and a friend of mine had called and said, I have the perfect job for you, and she kind of had to talk me into it to just do an interview. And I'm very, very grateful, because it's just been a super great, interesting job and a really good fit for me personally.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And for those who don't know, can you just describe the work that the Vermont Women's Fund does?
Sure. The Vermont Women's Fund was started almost 27 years ago by a group of women who wanted to use financial power in order to make change. This is not unusual, and this was a wave of women's funds were starting across the country about that time, or in that time area, some bigger than others. And in Vermont, women were very dissatisfied with the kinds of services and programs that were serving women and girls. Well, there weren't any, essentially. There wasn't really a great gender distinction. And so understanding that women as caregivers and many other roles that they are forced to do because it's just assumed as part of our implicit bias of our culture, the Women's Fund helped organizations, nonprofits, develop programs and pilot programs that were to help women become more economically self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. So our role is as a philanthropic resource. We give financial grants to nonprofits across the state with programs and operating support in order for them to serve women and girls in their best economic interests.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And what are some of these programs that are offered?
The programs range, we kind of have three buckets we look at: essential services, workforce development, and systems change. And essential services are really helping women at the very margin, who are on the margins of the margins, women who are either homeless with children looking for transitional steady housing. There's a program, Capstone Community Action runs a program that teaches or helps young women who are moms get their high school diplomas, get back into them so that they can get a job. Mm-hmm. So that the essential services really range, helping women who are probably are the most economically depressed, mm-hmm. and trying to help them lift themselves up by learning new skills or just getting their high school diploma, for starters. Workforce development is also a broad category, but there are programs Vermont Works for Women, which is based in Burlington, runs many programs to help women learn skills in the construction trade because they pay well. And often, and they start actually at the middle school age now of getting girls interested in non-traditional skills like welding, car repair, again, plumbing, electrical, all the trades, which are going begging for people because Vermont's aging out. And then just on the flip side, Vermont Technical College has a great coding camp for girls that they run every summer, teaching girls coding. We help them develop that. We help them launch that. It's in its 4th year, I think now. It's been very popular. They work with UVM. Lisa Dion in the computer sciences runs a Girls Who Code camp. So we're looking at workforce development programs that help women and girls learn the skills that they need to start at a higher level entry point in a career path. And then systems change. And systems change is really looking at the whole system and how do we break these barriers of inequity. And we launched with our 2 partners something called Change the Story, which has been going on for 6 years, working in policy and program and philanthropy to help really change how we look at gender in the workplace. Mm-hmm. So it kind of runs the gamut, but
yeah, a lot of different options and a lot of incredible programs. How have these programs been impacted by the pandemic?
Sadly, very, very critically. It's actually pretty amazing when you dig into some of these programs. Like we support a couple of women's shelters and domestic abuse and sexual violence shelters. And to hear how an organization had to pivot from delivering services, for instance, counseling women who have been raped and they're in the hospital, and they had to transition to doing that over the phone. That really hit me. It was like, wow, this is so fundamentally difficult and different. And yet, I mean, every organization I know of and in the nonprofit world has done an incredible job of being able to accommodate and stay in touch with people who are in need. It's very, very difficult. And I mean, we've all experienced what it's like to be isolated. But that part of what all of these programs are doing is trying to break through that isolation in a safe and healthy way. And I think they've just done a phenomenal job. So the other part of the pandemic that I'm sure everybody's heard about, but when you look at the statistics about who has been most hurt in our economy, it's women of color have been the most impacted, and then women as a whole category have been the most impacted, whether it's job loss. 73% of women lost their jobs in the last November-December jobs report in Vermont. And then we have women who are being forced to choose between their job and taking care of kids at home. And whether they are in a partnership relationship or a single parent, it ends up falling to the woman. And so there's been a huge job loss and a career stall and a she-session for women because of the pandemic. So it's pretty disheartening.
Yeah, that's awful. Are there any new programs that the Women's Fund is offering to kind of try to mitigate the losses of all of the in-person programs that you used to do?
It's really, we're not the service provider. Mm-hmm. We fund the service provider, so we're not offering new programs. What we've stepped up our funding. Mm-hmm. We gave our funding cycle is usually April of the year, and so in April of 2020 we issued our grants as we had planned to organizations, and we made them unrestricted funds. You didn't have to report back. It was just, here's some money, do what you need to keep your doors open. And then we did some serious fundraising over the summer and issued another set of grants. Another $60,000 went out in December. And my goal is really to just increase our funding. We're doing that by fundraising. We're building our endowment. We're really engaged in partnerships with other organizations to work towards the same aim. But it's really just going to take a ton of resources right now. Mm-hmm. The changes on the other side will happen. I mean, for example, childcare. We need an affordable, high quality childcare system in this state in order for women to be able to work, and families. I mean, this is not a woman only problem, but it affects women disproportionately, and then affects families, working families. So we really are working closely with an organization called Let's Grow Kids that's spearheading childcare in this state. We're backing them, and we'll be supporting them and anybody else that's working towards childcare.
Yeah. And back to before, you mentioned the Vermont Women's Fund is a partner of Change the Story. Can you speak a little more about that?
Sure. It's not complicated, but it's something we started at the Women's Fund in collaboration and partnership with the Vermont Commission on Women, which is a state agency, and Vermont Works for Women, which I mentioned before, which is a nonprofit program provider. And with some really extraordinary leadership from a woman named Tiff Bloomley, who's now a legislator, and you might want to talk to her on this show.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll connect you. Tiff was the one who had been the director of Vermont Works for Women for 17 years and done great work, but came out saying, we really haven't moved the needle for women in Vermont through my work in this program. And she said, let's bring together philanthropy, policy, and program and work together to see if we can fast track gender equity in Vermont. And that was our goal. And so we formed this initiative. Change the Story is not its own nonprofit. It's not its own program. It's an initiative, like a campaign, to heighten awareness of gender inequity. And this started 6 years ago. So it's been a very steady and successful effort, but it was a much bigger systems change campaign to raise awareness around gender inequity in the workplace, and for policymakers, and in nonprofits, like the whole sector of working sector. And we started our work by, and when I say we, it's now all three partners and Change the Story, the Tiff and the women, Jessica Nordhaus and Al Johnson-Kurtz, who now run it. We started with data because there was no current data on the economic status of women in Vermont and hadn't been in over 10 years. So we hired researchers actually at UVM, and these women put together 5 research reports. The first on women, work, and wages, second on women in occupational segregation, like what occupations were women working in, which have sadly remained about the same since 1970. There are more women who are nurses in healthcare and education as teachers than there are as construction workers and other male-oriented firms. But so we gathered research. We also did research reports on women in business ownership and women in leadership. And those 4 reports were created, and they're really, really very readable. And we have distributed them across the state. Every legislator got copies of those reports. And over time, that has built. So that research then became the benchmark for measuring how we're doing in Vermont. And so by creating the benchmark and highlighting the need, for instance, nobody knew, myself included, that 42% of women working full-time in the state of Vermont cannot meet their basic needs. Yeah.
Wow.
It's a huge, we have so many women in low wage industries, hospitality, service industry, and they pay poorly. And if you have a dependent child, you cannot, and the numbers for women with dependent children are even worse. So like these were statistics nobody knew about until we presented them. And with that as a benchmark, now we're trying and working towards improving those numbers, highlighting really awareness was a huge part of this. So I believe we've built quite a platform of awareness now among key critical leaders, business leaders and policymakers. How you fix the problem, that's the next step. And the pandemic has kind of turned everything upside down because for a variety of reasons, but one is also when you start looking at racial equity. And I think Vermont, and I can certainly say the Women's Fund, was somewhat guilty of having a very white outlook. And we had already a year before, 2019, started looking at racial equity and realizing women of color were being disproportionately hit even harder, just in regular life, let alone the pandemic. So yeah, there's just a lot. There's a lot to take in, and there's a lot to work on. But they're really important issues, and we're a small state. We have the ability to make change. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I guess on a different note, I know a lot of the change, like the real change, comes from policymakers, from legislators, and the former president, who, in my opinion, was one who condoned and participated in misogyny and sexism. Fortunately, we do not have that president anymore. But did you ever find yourself over the past 4 years discouraged with your work because of these actions?
Actually, former President Trump was my aha moment, because I'd been at the Women's Fund for 3 years. Yeah. And we were doing great work, and I was going along, just enjoying myself and thinking about stuff, not thinking too deeply. And when I heard that Access Hollywood tape of him, that's when I just got really, really pissed. That was my aha of, wow, this cannot go on. We cannot have someone not just like him in power. We cannot have men who think like that and who are so denigrating to women.
Yes.
And it lit a fire under me that actually propelled me to where I am today in terms of knowing how important it is to make change, and knowing that it really isn't going to happen unless women take more control of our culture and how we want to be treated and how we want to treat others of all, colors, all genders. We're not a binary population. And I'm very heartened by our new administration, by the president and by Vice President Harris, clearly working in the right direction. But as we know, there are a lot of people who are still think in the very limited binary way and really dated thinking about women. And that's perpetuated. Look at our sports. I mean, look at a lot of our cultural heroes, and it's just so baked in. We have a lot of work to do to change just the biases that we all are imbued and we live with every day, and we don't even notice them. Yeah, so that's where money comes in, because money is power. And for the Women's Fund, we need to be raising our funds so we can distribute money. We're an activist organization. We're not sitting on our money. But in order for people to be able to make change, they need resources. So, absolutely. Sorry, I get a little carried away there.
Oh, no, I love it. Your passion is palpable, and I really appreciate it. What is the most rewarding part of all of this?
Well, there are two things. One is when I hear the stories of women and girls that we serve with our funding, and when I hear about someone who was living in a shelter with her 2 children and didn't have anywhere to turn, but the program that we helped support gave her some skills in order to get that first job. One other story that is, I can be more specific, at a domestic abuse shelter in Rutland, they have a program that was an internship with some area businesses, and Green Mountain Power was one of the businesses. And this woman who was living in the shelter had absolutely zero self-esteem, had been living with an abuser for years and years and years, and she finally got out, but she did not know what to do, but she had worked and had a job for many years. She took the internship at Green Mountain Power, which just was a life changer. It gave her confidence. It turned into a full-time job. She was able to start making enough money so she could get her own place. You know, a lot of what happens, so that inspires me and makes me so happy that we, you know, if we can help one person, any of us individually can help one other person, one other human being, we're doing something. And so that's how I feel with a women's fund on a bigger level. So that's, and I also really, and I'm going to just be completely my usual unfiltered self, I'm somewhat mercenary. I get really excited raising money because I love knowing that if I can build the resources in the Women's Fund, we can get more money out the door. So when I get a big donation or when I get a small donation with a really nice letter, it makes my day.
Yeah.
So anyone who wants to give $5, make my day.
Yeah. And for my final question, just can you explain to the viewers how they can help the Vermont Women's Fund, how they can make donations?
I would love everybody out there to just know about us. First of all, just go to our website, vermontwomensfund.org. Mm-hmm. Check out what we're doing. I haven't updated the website in a little while, but it tells our story. There's a donate button obviously there. But I'd love even more than a donation. I'd love your interaction, your thoughts. If people want to just get in touch with me, my address is right there too. Let me know what you're doing. Let me know how we could help. We'd love to partner. So thank you for having me.
Yes, Meg, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. I feel incredibly inspired, and I hope that everyone who is watching feels that also. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care, Sarah. Hope I hear from you soon.
Absolutely.
Okay.